From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. As an extension agent, I get a lot of questions about pollinator habitat and roadsides. Roadsides constitute a big area in every state, and they connect together many different habitats that seem a natural fit for pollinator habitat. But I always scratch my head because I didn't know anything about roadsides. So I was so excited this week to get an invitation from Robert Marshall, who's the Roadside Development and Landscape Architect Program Lead at the Oregon Department of Transport. I went down to ODOT in Salem, and we had a conversation where he laid out some of the obstacles to putting in pollinator habitat, but also profiled and featured a number of real success stories here in Oregon of community groups partnering with ODOT to create pollinator habitat. This is a great episode. It answers a lot of my questions, and I hope it sort of demystifies roadsides and pollinators for you. This week, Robert Marshall on pollination. I am so delighted to be in Salem at the Oregon Department of Transport with Bob Marshall. Welcome to Pollination.
Well, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, one of the reasons was we had a bunch of listeners who contacted us that were really delighted to see lupins planted in the medians. I had seen them on the I-205 going to the airport. Tell us a little bit about the story of where those lupins came from.
That was an interesting story. Those lupins were actually the Russell hybrid, which are a horticultural introduction that are derived from the native lupin, the Lupinus polyphyllus.
Okay.
And so the Lupinus polyphyllus, as everybody has seen, the native blue lupin that has these big spikes of blue flowers. The Russell hybrids have colors in coral and pink and yellow.
Oh, that's right.
And along I-205, there is the project was a cable barrier, which is a flexible barrier, but if a vehicle runs off the road, this cable barrier would stop it from running into oncoming traffic.
Okay.
So the construction of this cable barrier, it disturbs a lot of soil, and the lupin was used for a couple of reasons. For one, it's in the pea flower family, so it fixes nitrogen into the soil, and as you can imagine, roadside soils are not really your rich garden soil. These are pretty barren soils. So having the lupin there can kind of introduce the nitrogen into the soil, so basically fertilizes the roadside.
Yeah.
And ODOT is not without an aesthetic sensibility, and we've got a landscape architect, his name is Magnus Bernhardt in Region 1, who likes to do the right thing for aesthetics, and he introduced those lupins into the disturbed ground. And what made it especially interesting is that during the evening rush hour, vehicles are going very slow, and so they've got time to look out their window and botanize. And meanwhile, the sun is setting on the western horizon, and so the light is coming up horizontally through these warm-colored flowers, and they basically just lit up. And you were right, the contact to ODOT lines pretty much just jumped off the hook, with people really, really pleasantly surprised to see that the agency was, flecking the roadside with flowers.
Well, it did look magnificent, and I was, I think, crawling in traffic at that point, going to the airport and seeing it, and it was really delightful. It really made the commute wonderful. And I guess that people think of lupins and think, oh, these are pollinator flowers, but ODOT has programming around pollinators specifically. Can you tell us a little bit about that programming?
We've got kind of a pollinator task force, and one thing I can go back to the lupin a little
Yeah,
bit.
please.
One thing I like about the lupin, other than the fact that they fix nitrogen, is that they have a really unique flower that has kind of closed flower parts, and it takes a bumblebee, a real strong, robust, broad-shouldered bee, to kind of work open the plant parts to get at the nectar and the pollen. And so the bumblebees are not really thriving like we hoped they would. And so putting a flower out there that specifically saves its goodies for the bumblebees, I think is kind of a nice aside to having a pretty roadside flower.
That's what was going through my mind when I was driving by. In addition to enjoying the multicolored display, is here is a piece of land where, and it's really wonderful hearing the story because it was multi-purpose. It looked good, it was fixing nitrogen, and it also was helping pollinators at the same time. But you were mentioning that ODOT also has a specific focus on pollinators through a pollinator health task force.
Yeah, we've got this task force, and that started the pollinator task force. It started with the. Let me start. Well, there was a group of people on the Central Coast who wanted to manage the roadside for pollinator habitat, and they got the ear of the director at the time, Matt Garrett, and they beat their fist on the desktop and insisted that they be allowed to do that. So the director put together actually he came to the geoenvironmental group, which is what I am a part of.
Okay.
And he said, make this happen. And so the pollinator task force was kind of assembled. I was not an employee of the agency at that time, but it started before I got here, and it has done quite a few things, kind of working through the different regions in the state. I am the Roadside Development Program leader, and so I try to set an agenda, and I try to inspire with some enduring values, but I've got no directing authority over what staff do. So
Okay.
I'm a policy wonk, basically.
Okay.
And so that's how I got involved in the pollinator task force.
Okay, that's really interesting. It's interesting to have the agencies responsive to stakeholders and what they're asking for, and sort of coming up with a task force in response. And I know there have been a number of projects that have a specific focus on pollinators. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Oh, sure. Well, it can be either a very short story or a very long story, because it is only just recently that the Pollinator Task Force has actually gotten some of their ideas put into the ground.
Okay.
The Coastal Pollinator Habitat Project was only signed as an intergovernmental agreement a couple of months ago.
Oh,
and so
fantastic.
that what that will do basically is ODOT had to identify areas where it would be safe for citizens to work on the roadside. If you know Highway 101, it can be very narrow.
Very.
It is already as lush as is possible. You couldn't, if you were to drop a dime through the vegetation, it wouldn't hit the ground. The vegetation is so dense. So we had to find areas where people could pull off and park, where there were gaps in the vegetation that was on ODOT right-of-way, and where the people working on the roadsides could be safe.
Okay.
And so we put together a spreadsheet of about, I think it was about 120 different sites on 25 miles between Newport and Waldport, and came up with about 30 that would satisfy the different requirements of that task force, of the citizen group.
Okay.
Some of the other projects that we worked on, I don't know if you travel Highway 26 over Mount Hood, but that was a safety project, which was not pollinator focused at all. That was to create a wider shoulder so that on that narrow road where people are coming back from the mountains after being, doing their exercise and getting tired, it needed to be safer there.
Oh, yeah.
And again, like on the median project, they included lupins in the seed mix. And in that situation, it had to comply with the U.S. Forest Service guidelines and had to be species true. It couldn't be any horticultural hybrids of the native lupin that lived there. I believe that was also polyphilous. But sometimes we have to use the Lupinus rivularis, which is the riverbank lupin, because it has less of the alkaloids, which are toxic to herbivores, to cows, basically. That's just one of the concerns we had. Anyway, driving over Mount Hood in the springtime, you'd come across these newly cut hillsides that weren't raw like you usually expect at construction sites, but they were just carpeted in blue. So not a pollinator project, but
a very but serving pollinators.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. Another project that we worked on that actually is a pollinator-specific project was out in Beaverton, where existing roadsides were, again, our landscape architect in Region 1 negotiated with maintenance to revise their maintenance practices so that they would mow close and tight immediately adjacent to the roadway, so that if a runaway or of an errant vehicle, somebody dozed off or spaced out or something, kind of wanders off the road, they've got a safe area they can recover and get back onto the road, a recovery zone.
Oh, yeah.
And so that would be mowed tight, but the interior of the interchange quadrants were allowed to grow. And wildflowers, or sometimes kind of introduced flowers like the Shasta daisy, were in the ground, were in the seed bank already. So by not mowing the interior of the quadrant, flowers that were already in place were allowed to go through their life cycle, and that was very pleasant to see that happen.
Fantastic.
Similarly, on I-5 in Portland, just north of the Terwilliger Curves, it was not long ago they built a big retaining wall to add that another width of shoulder.
Yeah.
And they backfilled against that big retaining wall with soil and capped it with good topsoil. And the intent, you can see it, that there are trees growing there, but the landscape architect introduced an entire successional community so that there was a introductory ground plane of wildflowers that will eventually kind of dissipate as the trees grow taller and shade out the wildflowers. So that was a good one. And in Medford, the maintenance crew had some leftover guardrails and some leftover soil, and they worked with Tom Landis down in Medford and created a purpose-built monarch way station.
Fantastic.
with the milkweed. So that was very cool. Other ones we've got, I don't know if you knew that ODOT, in their construction of new roads, they impact sometimes a valuable habitat. And I don't really recall which the project was, but they ran through and disturbed a section of Kincaid's lupin, which is the host plant to the Fender's blue butterfly. And to mitigate that, they bought 35 acres of kind of degraded agricultural land on which there were already some remnant patches of Kincaid's lupin. So they went after this 35 acres, and they did controlled burns, and they did weed removal, and they introduced new Kincaid's lupin. And it has turned out to be just kind of a wonderful Willamette Valley meadow. There's Sedalcia and Lomatium and Brodia and the Kincaid's lupin, and that's a nice one. So, and that's kind of what we've got going on for pollinator.
That's a lot. And they all sound really remarkable. And I guess the thing that strikes me in that story is this. I was thinking about the one in Beaverton specifically. It's not just when we've talked to people in agricultural land, for example, when they put in pollinator habitat, they have a certain operational considerations, but the operational considerations, the maintenance of all of this land must take thousands and thousands of person hours to maintain. This is a very complicated procedure. Trying to fit pollinator habitat in to this very intricate management scheme with all these competing considerations must be very difficult.
You have no idea. But we'll soon talk about that. So, it's cool. It's cool. The agency, we are the stewards of more than 50,000 acres that are not under pavement, and this is public land, and it is in everybody's best interest that we make use of that land to the best public good. Now, obviously, we're a transportation agency, and managing it primarily for safe and efficient transportation is the prime directive.
Well, tell us about some of those challenges. What kind of challenges when the staff that's out on the front lines, sort of managing land, what do they encounter? What do people need to what don't we know of the challenges that they face?
Well, a challenge to putting pollinator habitat in place is the most obvious one is that maintenance mows sometimes when the plants are blooming, and that kind of abbreviates the pollination cycle.
Because it must be tough, because they've got they can't schedule they've got a lot of land in a short period of time they have to.
Well, it's even shorter than because they can't really, and we're talking about the Willamette Valley here, because on the east side of the Cascades, they really don't mow at all.
Gotcha.
And there's really lots of very viable habitat on the east side of the Cascades. Mm-hmm. On the west side of the Coast Range, there's hardly any right-of-way at all. Mm-hmm. The short pine come right up to the back of the roadside ditch. So we're talking about the Willamette Valley.
Okay.
And it is one of the most generous landscapes in the country. So stuff wants to grow here. Mm-hmm. Maintenance can't mow early because it's still so soggy, the equipment will sink.
Oh, right.
And they can't mow late because the equipment will spark fires.
Oh, right.
So what you thought was a short window, you can just pretty much cut that in half.
Okay.
And so meanwhile, people don't, people see the mowers out there and they go, oh, maintenance is mowing again. But their plate is crazy full. Uh-huh. They've got everything that happens in the winter. So they got a plow, even in the Willamette Valley. They got to remove snow.
Yeah.
They do landslide repair, homeless camp cleanup, noxious weed control, cleaning up after sometimes just terrible accidents.
Yeah.
They have to remove roadkill.
Uh-huh.
And then they get new tasks kind of put on them all the time. Because the pavement is an impervious surface and motor vehicles are by nature kind of funky. Uh-huh. There is pollution that comes off the road, and because ODOT is we are signatories to some permit obligations to keep the waters of the state clean because of endangered species. We are required to treat the water that runs off of new construction, new impervious surface.
Yeah, okay.
And so we use bioswales and slopes, and we use the soil microorganisms and the physical properties of plants to intercept and to break down pollutants. And so this is a whole raft of work that maintenance didn't really expect 10 years ago. This wasn't even on the radar.
Okay.
So maintenance has a lot of tasks, and not just to do these things, but they have to maintain the roadsides for safe and efficient transportation. And what that means is they have to remove obstacles in the safe runoff and recovery zone, have to remove hazard trees, they have to remove fire fuel, and keep sight lines open. They have to remove cover for large wildlife. And so they have many masters. And then regarding pollinators, what you and I take for granted is that, the things bloom and then they turn brown and the seeds scatter and the life cycle begins again. But some housefrau driving by in a big Suburban, she sees the spent flowers and she thinks that ODOT doesn't care.
Oh, it's been neglected.
So
it might look that way because they don't understand this is deliberate and we're trying to establish that.
Right.
Of course, that's
and
understandable.
Then the phone calls come in,
yeah.
and maintenance is beholden to the public, and so
course, yeah.
that is definitely a consideration. So that is one of the big challenges that we have to face. Maintenance has many masters, and having to find places in the landscape where pollinator habitat is appropriate, it takes a little bit of thinking. But there are these places. If we've got a project with long slopes, because right-of-way real estate is expensive, the slopes are pretty steep and mowers never go there. So that is perfect for wildflowers. There could be situations where there's a guardrail. Mowers don't need to go behind the guardrail. That could be good pollinator habitat. And the agency has facilities. They've got borrow areas. Sometimes they need rock. They've got disposal areas. Sometimes they need to get rid of dirt. And there are rest areas. There are trails like the Portland Springwater Trail or the Medford Bear Creek Trail are ODOT land that are isolated from traffic. And so that's all the better for pollinators. There's concern that vehicle strikes take out pollinators, and that's true. But if you've got habitat there, it's research has shown that the abundance is increased at a greater number than the vehicle strikes remove specimens.
Oh, right. Okay. I imagine that I hadn't thought of that. That they're having the habitat in the vicinity may have this negative effect, but actually it just outweighs it because you're producing more bees in that habitat. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, and it's also been proven with research is that if you've got a generous smorgasbord of different flowers that have different bloom times, and so the bees don't want to go anywhere. They're lazier than I am, and if they've got all their sustenance right there, they'll stay right there and just stay at the trough.
Okay.
So,
all right.
But so what other? I was talking about where there are good places for pollinators along the roadsides. Even though we've got some areas like facilities or rest areas that are points, the agency has corridors, and corridors have a special value in wildlife management in that they can connect habitats. And so for monarch butterflies, for example, it is known that the western tribe of the monarch butterflies can be in eastern Oregon, but they want to go to central California in the winter. And so there is a north-south corridor that isn't exactly known what their migration route is, but ODOT has roads that go there.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have developed a strategy where immediately adjacent to the roadsides, they've got it cordoned off into kind of hypothetical zones. Zone 1 is the shoulder. Zone 2 is the ditch and to the back side of the ditch.
Yeah.
And then Zone 3 is from the back side of the ditch to the limit of the right-of-way line.
Yeah.
And within that Zone 3, there could be some runoff and recovery zone, which is clear of obstructions and the vegetation is kept low in case a vehicle needs to recover and get back on the road. But in that Zone 3, that is an option for introducing or preserving pollinator plants. So
Oh, that's fascinating. So one thing I got out of this is the maintenance crews have a lot of challenges that they face, but there are these opportunities. You're talking about those steep slopes, for example, these Zone 3 areas, especially an area which is serves this really corridor purpose for wildlife such as pollinators.
right, we don't want to preserve. We don't want to use the roadsides for deer or elk. That's
Oh, right, of course. Yeah, because those don't need to be close to the road.
They don't need to be close to the road at all.
But there are these opportunities, and I guess the task is in some ways identifying where these prime spots are and really targeting resources towards them. And I guess that brings me sort of the last question I wanted to ask you about was the Pollinator Task Force. And you talked a little bit about it at the beginning, sort of being really developing in tandem with stakeholders' interests.
Sure.
Where do you see? Tell us a little bit about the structure of it, and where is it going, and some of the, where you. Tell us a little bit about the task force.
Well, what we first of all, there are very few landscape architects in the state, but the ones that are working on projects, that is where these opportunities are identified. It could be something like the middle of a roundabout, it could be a steep slope, but these are areas that are disturbed as part of a project.
Mm-hmm.
So the landscape architects, and where there is no landscape architect, it could be a botanist or a biologist would work with me, and we'd come up with a plant palette to introduce pollinators where there aren't other conflicts. And some of those conflicts I hadn't even mentioned. For milkweed, for example, those have little parachutes on the seeds.
Yeah.
And if you've got an agricultural interest that borders the ODOT right-of-way, they do not want weeds corrupting the purity of their crops.
Mm-hmm.
So we get a lot of pushback from agriculture, and also money. The prime function of roadside vegetation for ODOT is to prevent erosion.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly flowering plants can do that, but grass can do that also, and grass seed's inexpensive.
Uh-huh.
And if you've got a good pollinator seed mix that has multiple species that have sequential bloom times,
That gets more expensive.
that gets more expensive. And not only that, some of the seeds are different than the models that are set up for germination and purity by our contract documents. Some seeds have a real hard shell, which will delay germination, and some seeds have like that little feathery parachute or a sticky coating, which makes it difficult to clean them. So that's purity and germination.
Wow.
And they mess up, they don't fit comfortably into the model which ODOT uses for its seed spec.
Yeah, so just to sort of reiterate this, so for ODOT, obviously, its prime concern is to keep the soil in place and, avoid that kind of maintenance issue. And that can really efficiently be done with plants that don't necessarily serve pollinators like grasses. That can be done cheaply and efficiently, and it serves taxpayers that way in being able to do that. But in some of these pollinator plants, they can be expensive, and there are these spec issues where it makes it very difficult to sort of build them in. Okay, that's very fascinating. I would never have thought of that in a million years. Like, why don't they just put flowers in there? There's a reason.
There is a reason, but there's enough for everybody. So we have found ways that we can do pollinator plants, and clearly, if you're introducing lupin, for example, then you're introducing a fertilizer into the soil, which also helps the erosion control plants stabilize the ground. And so we're working it.
Okay,
we're working it. So what are some of the things that we're doing? I had mentioned that one of the talking points we're kind of bouncing around is a pollinator corridor, and this is just at the talking stage right now. But my monarch corridor on the east side of the Cascades, it could be done really simply and cheaply just by planting some seeds along the fence line, because on the east side of the Cascades, for example, Highway 395 or Highway 97, those are north-south corridors. The maintenance doesn't mow there, and there are milkweed species that live in every ecoregion of the state that's not above timberlines. So that's a thought that we're playing with.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah, and it's crazy good to have these. I mean, even if it's just at the talking stage, at least we get to be thinking about fun stuff that's fascinating and serves a greater good.
Of course.
So that's one of them, and really, I'm trying to get involved and make more contacts and relationships in the districts. The highway division operates out of 5 regions, but the maintenance operates out of districts, and I think there's 18 or 20 districts.
Yeah.
And because maintenance really, they make the decisions about exactly how the roadsides are maintained. And these are Oregonians. They love this state. They know how beautiful it is. And I'm from Portland, and I'm not a shooter, or I don't fish much anymore. But the people who down in Southern Oregon are hunting, they are nature wise. They see all the connections, and they appreciate that what they can do on the roadsides is not just some tree hugger's fantasy, but this is part of the mosaic of Oregon.
Absolutely.
So I want to get out there and talk to these people and talk to them about opportunities, and that's really where I see the program kind of blossoming.
Well, I guess, and that's just thinking about the task force and its origins. It comes from a deep community engagement, thinking community interests, and really that seems like a very sensible way to do things, to really take the lead from what the community wants. Because I imagine different communities across Oregon have different interests.
Oh yeah, very much so. But it is kind of irrefutable that every place in the state loves their wildflowers.
Of course.
You don't have a lot of people who hate those flowers. Gosh darn it.
No, there aren't. There aren't any actually.
Well, we haven't talked about purple loosestrife.
Oh, okay. Well, we do have. I guess this is the other. Maybe the other issue is. I imagine roadways are great corridors for invasive weeds to travel up and down, and so you do have this other, being mindful about.
Oh, yeah. Well, you probably never think about it.
Yeah.
But have you ever driven behind a hay truck?
Stuff coming off all over the place.
Right,
Yeah.
And the hay has seeds of its parent crop.
Yeah.
Next time you're off in the hinterlands, look at what's growing right on the roadside, and you say, well, dang, that looks just like wheat.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for that,
Right,
because
of course.
the hay trucks are seeding our roadsides throughout the state. and there's a lot of weeds. And
Okay,
what are you gonna do?
No, I imagine this is one of those many tasks that roadside maintenance staff, or one of the multi-purpose. I've gained a lot of appreciation for the many hats they're forced to wear.
Right. Yeah. It's but they're out in nice country sometimes too. So. A lot of what they do is kind of heroic. I mean, some of the snowplow stuff, I can't imagine being out there at 3 a.m. in a driving snowstorm, driving a 30-ton truck with a blade on the front.
I am always appreciative when they come by. Well, let's take a quick break. I want to come back. We ask all our guests some questions. We ask them all the same questions. Really curious about what your answers are going to be. And we're back. Okay, so 3 questions. We've never had
I'm a roadside development program coordinator.
We've never had a roadside development program coordinator on the show. Your answers will color the whole occupation.
Okay, well, I never really thought that I would be the poster boy for all landscape architecture listening, but I will try to represent them with dignity.
I am sure of that. So the first question we have is, do you have a book that you'd like to recommend to people?
If the people listening are plant geeks,
many are, I can tell you that.
I have just dog-eared the heck out of my Franklin and Draness Natural Vegetation of Oregon and Washington. This is kind of a plant geek Bible that it inventories the plant communities of the Pacific Northwest
really?
Right down to species. And so you can be looking at an alder swamp and get the whole list of species associated with that community. They go into some of the odd bird communities like the serpentine soils down in the Southwest, or Lahars. It's a fascinating book.
Let me get this straight. So you would tell us how the book functions. I'm always thinking, oh, it's not a plant book. This is a plant community book. So how is it organized?
It is organized by ecoregions.
Okay.
And so it would have like the Oahe uplands as one ecoregion. It would have the high Cascades as an ecoregion, or the old Cascades as an ecoregion, or the Columbia Plateau. And it organizes plant communities which fit into that ecoregion. Obviously, the riparian areas would kind of transition through all of them. But
so is it kind of like along a moisture gradient within the region? Is that sort of
well, there's moisture and soil type and altitude, and there are many different factors which contribute to what defines a plant community. Like the Southern Oregon has ultramafic soils. That means a very high iron nickel content to the soils, which I won't geek out too much, but they're basically infertile. Mm-hmm. And so that's why you have plants that grow there that grow nowhere else. For example, some of the carnivorous plants which have found another way to acquire nutrients than from the soil.
I remember as well from people in the Oregon Bee Atlas is one of the areas with very unique plant species, and so we find pollinators there that we don't find elsewhere in the state. Well, this sounds like a fascinating book, and it also sort of highlights, we're not in Nebraska. We've got such diversity. We have so many little niches that this really is kind of driving both plant and pollinator diversity. And when it comes to land management, it must make things very complicated.
Yes, it does.
Well, the next question I have for you is, do you have a go-to tool, a tool that you find indispensable for the kind of work you do?
Oh, absolutely. The Google. And the Google will invariably take me to the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service plant database.
All right, tell us about the data. You're the first person to, strangely, to plug the plant database. Tell us how it works.
Well, what I do in Google is I just usually I use the scientific names because those are the real ones, and type in to Google, and then it'll give me the list of options, and then the database will show up there, and the database initially comes up with a map. And the map shows the entire, I haven't gone over the whole world, but stay in the United States and Canada, and it will show you the range of that plant down to the county, and it will tell you if that plant is a native or introduced, and then it can give you the wetland indicator status, and there, for many of the plants, it will have a PDF of a plant guide, which will give you the ethnobotany of the plant, which is how it was used by the First Nations, and what kind of, if it's cord or food or medicine to that plant. And did you know that the genus of milkweed, Asclepias, is named after the Greek god of medicine?
I am Greek, and I did not know that.
Well, now
I'm going to be like pushing that.
But the milkweed,
Yeah.
even though it is full of toxins, those toxins have medicinal purposes.
For sure.
Then, and so anyway, if you're plant geeking out, some of the ethnobotany that you get into these plant guides just takes you on the story of the plant, and so those are tools that I find very handy.
But I imagine for restoration, and I know NRCS also has lots of technical guides as well, specific to the region, where they can really help you think carefully about plant selection and where you are. So this must also be a very important tool for, if you're trying to recreate those plant communities in the book that you described, kind of like thinking about more in detail about those plants and their needs.
Right, and it gives you some information. Like again, I'm also the erosion and sediment control program leader. So if you're looking at the plants, you said, well, this one germinates very quickly, but then it dissipates in the landscape. Well, for erosion and sediment control, that's a perfect nurse crop. It can provide erosion and sediment control and then go away, while the more premium plants may be something with a deeper, more broad-spreading root system or with a good floral function. Those are often more slow to mature and really fill that niche. So the USDA database is a good resource that has a real depth of information that is very useful.
Well, this is fascinating. And I get the sense you're a person who knows a lot of plants. So I'm really interested in your answer to this last question about, do you have when you're looking at those plants, is there a pollinator species that really you get excited about?
Well, in case your listeners don't know, you fed me these questions ahead of time, and the question was, do you have a favorite pollinator species?
Yes.
And in that, I thought, well, my favorite pollinator species is the Lilium columbianum, which is that bright orange Columbia lily, because pollinators like it.
Oh,
it's
for
really
heaven's
lovely.
sakes.
But
look at you going back to that. I have a one-track mind. I think about the insects.
But now that I knew you would come around to that, and so I put on my thinking cap, and there is a yucca moth. And this yucca moth is the sole. The way I learned it, it might be wrong, but I learned it as the sole pollinator for the yucca whipplei. The yucca whipplei is an architecturally round sphere of kind of semi-rigid, sharply pointed leaves.
Yeah.
And this plant blooms once before dying, and it sends up a plant spike about 15 feet that's covered with white cream-colored
God.
flowers. And its common name is Our Lord's Candle. It grows on the kind of chaparral hillsides of Southern California and Arizona, and it is spectacular. The yucca moth
Wow.
is the sole pollinator, and so it pollinates the yucca and then injects its eggs into the seed pods. And the larva will eat about a third of the seeds out of the seed pod. So the yucca moth enables the yucca to persist, and the yucca enables the yucca moth to persist.
Wow.
And it's like a perfect symbiosis. And so that's my favorite pollinator insect.
That is spectacular. You've done your occupation very proud. Landscape architects around the world are applauding. Thank you so much. I found this a tremendously, there's a lot of this I had no idea about. I'm gained a lot of respect for the kind of work that departments of transportation do. Thanks so much for listening. Show notes with information discussed in each episode can be found at pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. We'd also love to hear from you, and there are several ways to connect. For one, you can visit our website to post an episode-specific comment, suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. You can also email us at pollinationpodcast@oregonstate.edu. Finally, you can tweet questions or comments or join our Facebook or Instagram communities. Just look us up at OSU Pollinator Health. If you like the show, consider letting iTunes know by leaving us a review or rating. It makes us more visible, which helps others discover pollination. See you next week.